Brent does something that I wouldn't have expected. Like he has videos up on YouTube that show his dog and sort of the adventures as a superhero, like 5-minute adventures. Pretty good. Thank you for tuning in, and welcome to The Size of Thoughts, Conversations with the Alliance of History Graduate Students. My name is Jacob Glicklick. I'm a graduate student and the producer for the show. The things you will hear over the next hour represent the views of Size of Thoughts and the people making them. Those opinions, conversations, and quotations do not in any way represent River West Radio. The persons responsible are solely the producer, guests, and people calling in. Consequently, River West Radio is not liable for legal issues arising from the content you're about to hear. Again, thank you for joining us. For guests this week, we have fellow graduate student Joe Walzer.
Hi.
And fellow graduate student Richard Lartz.
Howdy.
Thank you both for being here. So, for this week, thought we would build off some of the things we've been talking, in the first two episodes of this little show, in terms of connecting of the intellectual and historian to the public, to real people, to things of more immediate consequence, with bringing in the notion of space and the city that we live. So, initial question is, how do both of you think that sort of your role as historian, the work you've done, the fact that it is work of a specific and exploited type, changes, but the fact that it's Milwaukee, does that, is that part of sort of consciousness of being a historian in this particular city at this particular era?
Well, yeah, absolutely, Jacob. I think that I think that there's a tendency to think that there are more important urban histories and more important labor histories than those that happen here in Milwaukee, or what's being done here about Milwaukee. But it's really super important, I think, that that we kind of dive down and dig into some of the ways that Milwaukee is extremely unique. And might actually challenge some of the patterns that, or either challenge or complement some of the patterns that have been kind of, described by other historians about Chicago or New York, or some of the more active areas, quote unquote active areas. I think that one of the ways that we can, or that our work here as historian, or one of our jobs here as historians of Milwaukee, is to kind of not only inform this broader historiography, right, the broader literature that exists in these fields, but also to kind of help inform the people of Milwaukee too, of like why things are the way that they are. Not, of course, to suggest that there's a linear path to this, but perhaps even to like bring out what might have been some of the alternatives that could have been. Why did things happen this way? And so I think that that's one of our most important jobs, I think, here.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Milwaukee is unique, and it has some unique labor history that has occurred here. So, and the interesting part about it is some of it seems to be very much obscured by like what you were saying with stuff that happened in either New York or Chicago. Because either it wasn't flashy enough, or not enough attention was paid to it, or it was downplayed a lot later or something. But yeah, I would say that it's a really interesting history, I think, in Milwaukee. That's one of the reasons why I like not only living here but also studying here.
Yeah, I think also city of Milwaukee is somewhat obscured by its own later legacy and politics and development that have done a lot to de-emphasize what makes it most interesting and striking as a notion of, certainly in terms of labor and labor massacre and labor exploitation and battles and in terms of struggles, even if in some cases sort of unsuccessful ones, since then there's always the enormous politics that go into invisibility and amnesia in a certain way, that if you can render something as not people not aware of the alternatives, or the fact that a number of the things taken for granted now were not always taken for granted, that they were argued against, in some cases fought against successfully, at least for a time, then you've done a lot to just undermine possibilities of alternative, that there is no better course of politics or commerce available.
Right, and definitely on the other end of that too is then certain parts of Milwaukee's past end up getting overemphasized, perhaps even needlessly so. I think that a lot of one of the most important reasons for why we need to continually be looking at this is, because a new, fresh analysis, just like with all history, right? A new, fresh analysis of this, is going to help kind of bring out help complicate the story, help bring out some of the intricacies, and a new analysis at a new time might allow for certain consideration of certain things, and I think that so much of Milwaukee history has been dominated by people like John Gerda, who's done some fantastic work in trying to kind of highlight how rich the city's past is, but does do a lot of kind of generalizing and kind of whittling down the history to a digestible thing, easily digestible, singular narrative that that certainly didn't exist as he seems to make it out to be. So unfortunately, that then ends up becoming the dominant narrative for this city, right? And then other things get kind of buried then in this, as if that there aren't. Or they end up getting buried. I don't know.
Yeah. So I'm pressing you a little more on that. Maybe what sort of specificity or what areas or moments or themes do you think are the most unjustly forgotten?
Well, if I could mention one, a person that I did a paper on was Paul Grotka, who was a labor agitator during the 8-hour, let's say, demonstrations that were going on in the city of Milwaukee. And the interesting thing about it is the guy was like in the newspapers tons of times and stuff and everything for this like long drawn out trial where he was trying to basically prove that he didn't incite a riot. And in most even labor history books, like he gets like a quick little honorable mention or something like that, but then there's not really much on it because there really wasn't much on him. I mean, I had to go through a lot of newspaper sources to do it, but like somebody like that whose case was brought to the state Supreme Court even, and decided by them finally after fighting with him for like over 2 years about it that he was actually innocent, kind of shows that certain people in Milwaukee history who were like particularly vocal or like not liked by the greater establishment either were sort of pushed into obscurity or just kind of quietly silenced by history itself.
Well, I think that even more, among even more recent pieces of history too, I think that Patrick Jones's work, The Song of the North, kind of engages in something very similar, right? Where his narrative focuses so much on Father Grappi that other figures like Vel Phillips, for instance, who does play a major role in the work, but not to the extent that perhaps she, I'm sure that she would think that she had played in the actual history, and that she actually did play the history. And other people like Lloyd Barbie and other people that they end up getting buried in this story, which ends up becoming kind of a great white man history of the Milwaukee Civil Rights Movement. Which is kind of an interesting thing, and that's even an academic work too, a more recent academic work. So you can see this thing this kind of trend permeating throughout the field.
Right, but like one thing I find interesting about like the Father Grappi story is that I personally had never really heard of it.
Right.
Until I was taking graduate classes here, because you don't get that in your average everyday high school history class that talks about civil rights. They don't really talk about anything that really happened in here, like local in Milwaukee. So to me, that was like a completely fresh new thing that I had never heard whatsoever. And why that is, I'm not really sure, unless there's just not enough time in your average school year to cover that stuff or
Possibly.
what. I don't know.
But I mean, beyond that, it seems that there's clear ways that most people in Milwaukee now, including many cases people who are historians who not actually focus on the past of Milwaukee, are disconnected from that own legacy. I mean, I know that a couple weeks ago, Joe, you said that you were doing the trivia night at the bar of it. You did a round on Milwaukee history, and what was the highest that people?
I think it was 4. I think they got 4 correct.
4 out of 10, yeah.
And I tried to make it. Try to make it about Milwaukee streets, and so it's an accessible kind of avenue into the history, and try to make them, include as many contextual clues as possible, and still people had a hard time with it. So,
yeah, and I mean, I guess to an extent, we would expect that would happen with all aspects of history, where certainly some of the most interesting and challenging, issues of struggle are going to be de-emphasized. except in certain limited areas like grad seminars. But I guess, do you think that happens to a greater extent in Milwaukee than elsewhere, or is it simply a perspective that, I mean, specializing in somewhat of it, that there's just closer to the details that are obscured?
Well, I think that perhaps one of the reasons why that happens so much with Milwaukee history is that it's, until recently, it's really kind of, been left to the boosters, right? That they're, a grand history of the city comes out when there's a big anniversary, right? But beyond that, right? Yes, yeah, or it's left to, or it's left to the newspapers, and this kind of nostalgia narrative has kind of has really taken over. Unless there's a community group who has a historian that, but in which case it doesn't really kind of make its way out into the kind of the general knowledge area. But I think that there have been a lot of folks that are really working hard to make that or to really change that, and start kind of bringing out some of these lesser known tales.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think one thing about Milwaukee too is it's kind of overshadowed by this certain very large city to our south. That when you tell people, "Oh, I'm from Milwaukee," where is that? And then you have to use that particular place, which I'm not going to mention as a point of reference. So it's sort of like you have the really big, flashy brother right next to you. So what can you do to make yourself kind of stand out and stuff and everything? And so far, I think it's the beer that made Milwaukee famous. Baxter, if you're in Milwaukee, bark twice. Things like that. I mean, we get these little obscure things, or Happy Days or something.
To be fair, we also the launching point for a current governor as well as his current challenger for governor. So there's that little piece of legacy as well that can remember Milwaukee for.
Well, and I think that there is a general sense in the state that there is an understanding that Milwaukee is super important to the state's history, and that that the rest of the state's economy has been built around Milwaukee and around Chicago too. I have no problem saying that, but that the rest of the state has kind of acted like this hinterland, to use or to borrow Will Cronin's kind of analysis too, that what we think is of being the rural area around us is actually as much a part of the city as we are sitting here today.
And in terms of sort of the sense of again connecting with the legacy of city and trying to bring it in more challenging and direct ways, I'm reminded of there's a debate among Occupy Milwaukee group once it started in October of last year, with particularly after the premiering in Zeidler Square and having marched for a while and having the permit due to expire, some debate over whether to leave at that point, whether to force the issue, attempt to hold space, relocate to different space, which had a lot to do with different tactics of confrontation with the police, numbers issue, etc., but also had partly to do with the legacy of the city itself. I mean, there was the question of which areas mattered, or which ones were important to some of the participants, but clearly not all. Was Zeidler Square, because of association with Labor Day, something worth taking and applying this way? I don't know. So I mean, it's. And then, of course, an event ended up going in here in River West, about 2 blocks from where we're sitting now, at the Garden Park outside the Public House, which became seen as, I mean, it was able to have a small symbolic presence for over 100 days, but in some cases was where you would expect a Occupy Wall Street movement issue to flourish. It sort of, I think, became part of the River West counterculture to Milwaukee as a whole, and didn't. I mean, there's a number of other reasons I think why numbers didn't grow, but that was up. I do feel that the different histories linked to were important in that moment.
Go ahead, Joe.
All right. Well, I think that I think there's a lot going on there. I think that first of all, the Occupy movement was grossly overshadowed in that moment by the recall efforts.
Yes.
And I think that a lot of people's energy, I mean, I think that's kind of the blessing and the curse of Wisconsin at that moment was that as Occupy was kind of booming everywhere else, we kind of already had our moment in Madison and here, and it was kind of like the starting point for all of that, of course. And I think that there was a lot of energy already redirected into electoral matters, and I think that there's a precedence for that too, in kind of this labor liberal alliance that's kind of taken over. Not kind of taken over. I mean, that's been kind of the norm here for a very, very long time. And I think that one of the best examples of this is that Milwaukee's had a Labor Day celebration, since 1886, 1887. And the early celebrations up until probably about the Great Depression, and actually even beyond too, were largely leisure days, right? That they were just days set aside so that workers and their families could get together and play games and drink some beer and just kind of have a nice day, which also marks the end of summer for a lot of folks, and then having the long weekend too, and political speakers were guests. I mean, they were present. They were there. They try to engage workers as voters too, and there was a huge shift in that, probably starting, about the beginning of the Cold War and beyond. Now to the point where now Labor Fest, which these celebrations have moved from beer gardens to public parks, and now they're at the Summerfest grounds. Labor Fest has one stage, and then there's a bunch of booths then for unions to kind of have their swag out there. But politics is that's the name of the game there, right? Like a lot of it's labor leaders side by side with your local Democratic politician, right? That this kind of labor liberal alliance, it's no longer just an alliance anymore. I think that this is labor-backed liberalism, right? Or labor-backed politics. The liberalism aspect of this is probably can be under question here too. But the legacy is still there, and I wonder, maybe like you guys can maybe comment on this too, that might have had something to do with how the Occupy movement here in Milwaukee ended up taking the shape that it did. That like the existing channels. I mean, we've already kind of given away the alternative here in the city. To some extent, doesn't mean that it can't be achieved, but I think that there might be, an added hurdle there that so much of the established channels for this kind of activism has been dominated by these campaigns that are largely electoral.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, because really, I would say, especially when you're having like a recall effort or whatever, there's the people that are interested in that type of social change would also be interested in that same kind of vein of social change. And so, yeah, there's only so many people in that vein to go around. Mm-hmm. So I would say that's potentially, a factor. Also, I mean, I don't know, there's always good old-fashioned Wisconsin weather, too. That might have had some sort of a factor with it. I mean, because that teepee couldn't have been, like, blazing hot too often, but
but also it went from having the number of 1,000 for in terms of a few day for the first day of it, and then afterwards in terms of several hundred, and then in terms of 20, 30 regular some people. I mean, it just a sharp decline in terms of how many people and resources were available, to resist the weather. But I think with Joe, with your sort of larger point, I mean, would absolutely agree that the fusion or grotesque hybrid mutant of what has become the sort of superficially progressive statements of it, combined with organized labor to accept in terms of no strike guarantee in a way even in advance of what a lot of other organized labor in a lot of other states has done, which has mostly there seems like sort of symbolic channels or electoral mechanisms, which in some cases become a purely also symbolic in terms of the actual change made. And that's why what happened sort of actually in Wisconsin places was interesting. I mean, I think largely just because Walker was so clearly not, interested in playing the usual game or making an appearance of compromise, and was holding off that, even conservative-minded union leadership and conservative-minded Democrats were, had no better alternative than to use in terms of actual grassroots tactic and build off the energy, for a while, but then as soon as possible redirect it towards the recall effort, which which it seems like it has a common theme of something we've been discussing about how there's, in this sort of radical political space, it gets cordoned off physically. If it's, in terms of, and through the electoral channels, I mean, put all your energy in the ballot box, which is defined as a specific, very limited political space in which you can do very limited things. That is, months, or with the recall of Walker, we've been waiting over a year and talking in earnest for that, and that means that you're not spending energy or doing much stuff in the intermediate time, apart from registering people to vote and volunteering and having done some of the in terms of larger calls and home visits. I mean, treating potential voters like easily influenced sheep in an effort to try to get your very simplified, very centrist message through.
Well, and I think the recall efforts to also to steal some of that momentum away from other movements, like if we want to use, for example, the Bayview massacre, for instance, right? That really kind of put the clinch in the 8-hour campaign in Milwaukee for the most part. I mean, people were rounded up without warrants and just arrested and stuff. I think they arrested the entire board of the Knights of Labor. I mean, that's a momentum breaker, in some way. The funny thing too is then when Schilling, who's the head of the Knights of Labor, gets out, what's the first thing that he does? Turns to trying to make it labor politics to try and get people elected to change things. So it's like trying to do the exact same thing over again. It's labor taking something that's a movement that the average everyday person is doing on the street, and then trying to direct it towards what could be considered let's say a productive, a more productive avenue, one that's not going to be oh my god, there's riots and people are breaking windows just because they're walking around on the street. But turn it into something, nice and orderly and civilized, where they get to, kind of, call the shots or steer things in a particular way, or like you did door-to-door work. I did door-to-door work last summer, right? And they hand you this script to read. There's no way that you're going to say all of this stuff to somebody. There just isn't, right? Because you're saying you have to keep it short, sweet, and get to the point. You're not going to read off 4 paragraphs to these people that somebody spent a lot of time writing. But that right there, I mean, it just saps momentum out of, trying to do other things. And it's directing your narrative.
Encourages you to make activists as sort of like factory workers delivering a very specific, very mechanistic product.
And then they make you work overtime.
Yeah. Well, and it limits the ability to have a meaningful conversation with these folks. I think that, to have a script or to phone bank, go to door or whatever, I mean, you are, as you both have indicated, I mean, that's essentially, that's a rationalized way of getting to as many people as possible, which, of course there is a benefit to that, but, a lot of it ends up being redundant, right? Like you end up talking to people who've already made up their mind. In hopes of getting to somebody who's on the fence, in which case you're probably pissing them off, right? That you're probably the 14th person, in that week that's probably talked to them. But at the same time, it also, by doing that, you're limiting the ability to collectively achieve an alternative, right? I mean, if you're being paid to do this, you're forced to stick to the script. You've got a boss. You're being managed,
right?
Whatever.
You have a quota that you have.
Yeah, you've got a quota. I mean, you've got a territory that you've got to cover before you even come back.
Yep.
Or you've got a list that you've got to call before you can do any of that. I mean, it's really limiting the possibility that there can ever be an alternative, because our time has been so much devoted to this. Right. Absolutely.
Yeah,
right.
But except you're churning out voters instead, supposedly.
Right.
Yeah. And that's just. It really destroys that ability to try and have, let's say, like you were saying, a meaningful conversation with somebody at a door that might be someone you could possibly persuade if you had more time. But if you've got to hit a quota of talking to 60 people or something in a night, and you've got 150 doors that you have to go to, well then that's gonna really and you're having a bad night on top of it, you know, you're gonna try and rush through it and be like,
Yeah, and also that's why the organized labor be fueling its energy and its prospects for either change or even just like defensive reaction, like holding the line. We secure our gains by electing in terms of sort of officials that will be friendly to our interests, and that's where then in terms of the charges of union bosses controlling politics, or in terms of corrupt leadership of it that are playing political games. So therefore, Walker will play political game, more thoroughly and cut the bridge off. Become plausible to many people because the unions become so distant from what people fought, what people were slaughtered for in sort of the Bayview and elsewhere for the actual direct interest of it. But because securing interest of membership will need confrontation. Will need not simply a day every, in terms of year, 4 years, 2 years.
Yeah, what a thing for people to forget that people got shot trying to work only an 8-hour day and not having to work every Saturday.
Yeah, it becomes this weird, and I guess
take it for granted.
I guess hitting the electoral politics really hard, which I think is appropriate since we have literally 35 minutes. At the same time our show ends, so does the the polling places close, and then afterwards we'll go wherever we go next and have to figure out how to pressure who will either way be a sort of right wing, anti-union, anti-education, pro-corporate privatization, governor, but hopefully he'll be our corporate anti-union, anti-education governor.
Yeah. Well, and I think that maybe we're hitting on these tactics a little too hard, not giving credit where credit's due. Essentially, it kind of shows the power of where of how much the corporate power behind the print media, the broadcast media, the internet media, and how much the message is being controlled by by those special interests, to use Scott Walker's words there, to the point where we need to figure out how to have an alternative messaging source. And I think that is part of what the phone banking and the door-to-door stuff is trying to do. It's just that it's so directed to a very singular objective that really provides very little in terms of an alternative to what it is that as Jacob you had indicated. There's no mistaking it. I think that Tom Barrett will also be our corporate governor, right? But our neoliberal governor here. But I think that I think that there might be some things that we can take from this a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah. And
you could always say that no matter what, all politicians are dirty, right? And that they're never really going to do anything to completely represent the people or whatever. And really, both sides have their special interest groups. Simple as that, right? We're kind of talking about how labor tends to give to Democrats or to support them, right? Well, the right has its special interest groups too. They just tend to be wealthier people or more individuals that are fantastically wealthy, like that lady that gave him half $1,000,000.
Yeah, and I guess I love.
And how is that not a special interest? Right? Come on. They has anybody not seen the video where she's like, so when are we going to be a red state?
Yeah.
Right? When are we going to do this right to work stuff? She's literally I'm going to hand you money, and these are the things that I would like to see happen. That's a special interest too. I don't see what.
And that's kind of interesting how it's played out. That it now seems to indicate that the election will be fairly close and turnout is all important, but that the number of things that Walker has done and been implicated in have not. Really damaging. There's probably a few revealing tactics that will be clear that I'm sure is in terms of being watched. Not just by GOP and Democratic Party across the country, but by corporations and by ALEC across the country in terms of what happens. Since it shows clearly that even over a year after Walker did the things for which he is now in terms of possibly being recalled. There's been more scandals. There's been more further cuts to public sector. There's been aggressive promoting of, in terms of even just running through. I guess what's interesting in the last few months, not as much attention, but rollback of reproductive rights. That hasn't gotten the president, but all that's things that you'd think would accumulate to the point where the bubble would burst, but not necessarily. So either one, it's just the amount of campaign funding he's able to do. I think 23 million versus it's just like 3 million, not even counting a lot of super PAC donations, just are that significant that can completely deflect populist opposition, or people over that time span become just immune to charge of corruption, or something like, okay, he's corrupt, but Democrats are corrupt as well. Either way, if it's doing either way. I mean that's what's interesting. I mean that's not that many people who are enthusiastic lovers of our current political economic system. I mean you find some objectivists who are the moral utility of capitalism, etc. But for the most part, people will be cynical about the groups that are in power. They're likely to be in power, but they don't believe in possibility of an alternative. So many of those same people will be are voting for Walker now because they have an anti-union story of it, because there's a variety of reasons, some more reasonable than others, but
it shouldn't be about that. It shouldn't be just because you don't like unions that you're going to vote for Scott Walker, okay? Because, for instance, all right, if conservatives always like to say something about them being so good with bills or something and finances and everything else like that. So if guy says he's going to balance the budget and then he gives $1 billion in tax breaks to somebody, how is that being fiscally responsible? That's not being fiscally responsible at all. You don't give huge tax breaks out. Cutting things is one thing, right? But you don't cut things and then also cut your revenue coming in. That's not a way to balance your checkbook. I mean, because really, any banker worth their salt would be like, yeah, what did you think you were going to do here? You were not going to bring any money in, and then you were going to cut how much you pay us? Yeah, it doesn't make fiscal sense.
But I think often the psychology of this is that, well, whether it's what's none of these sort of things that Walker is doing or that's been happening even over the past 10 years, politics is like new or dramatic in any ways, but it is sort of a lot more blatant and explicit about whose interests are being favored. But I think also a lot of people generally are viewing that as the unalterable status quo, that it might be terrible, that it might be bad for them and their own economic interests, but they don't view that as something that they can really challenge, that they can really roll back and regulate business. So if you can do that, then it's sort of ingenious of the sort of system for neoliberal capitalism to, as I think it has done, provide channels of anger against people who are marginally better off. If it's public employee unions that might have health insurance and a bit of some security that I don't in my job, well, then at that point, I guess I could be sort of pushing towards better health insurance for everyone. But if I don't think that's achievable, then it makes sense on a base human level to just try to drag other people down a little bit more. That does become a way that sort of the pundits and demagogues and politicians who are skilled at channeling that anger, and because at the same time sort of the left hasn't had either the commitment or, among people who are committed, the organization and reach beyond activist subculture to put a viable alternative, it creates a way that there's some validity to this sense that unions do not actually represent workers' interests, so that being away from them is not does not outrage. I mean, it still outrages some people, but many others it doesn't, or they're outraged the opposite direction.
Yeah, well, it turns out that divide and conquer tactic, it worked like a charm. I mean, I think that the political climate was right. I think that this was cold and calculated, and I think that they picked the right time to do this, to pit one side against the other, for their own gain, and it really struck an incredibly powerful chord, and it's highly classist. Yes, of course. I mean, it's within classist language, but it's also highly racist too. I mean, I think that it strikes a chord when people talk about. I was just in Fond du Lac actually visiting my folks recently, and I think that there's a lot of folks up there that when they talk about welfare recipients, they're talking about black folks. I think that I don't think that they it's not broken down. Like I don't think that there's the complex understanding of what that really means.
No, see, because the ones I know, they had Mexicans and Chinese people into there too.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yes, and then yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's a simplification and whatever whatever the tactic was. I mean, I'm as a historian, I'm going to be very, very interested in seeing, what kind of documentation might come out of this. As far as what were some of the decisions that were made, that what was actively created and what did they just kind of stumble into, right? Like, I think that, perhaps Wisconsin was supposed to be a testing ground, and what, if it didn't work here, where else would they have gone, to try to force it somewhere else? But it worked incredibly well here. So, I think that this election is going to have some pretty, broad-reaching implications. And I think that as our fellow graduate student John Terry has indicated in the past, I think that I don't want to misquote him, but I think that this is going to be if Scott Walker wins this, it's going to be a tremendous victory for the right. If Tom Barrett wins this, it's not going to be a huge victory for the left at all.
No, kind of like an exhausted one.
Yeah.
Because, they spent a lot of time and energy, working on this. A lot.
Yeah. And also, Barrett's not going to be pushing for, reversal to the education council. Probably collective bargaining restoration eventually, if there's this election and a few other elections, for the unions that had it before at the level of energy and militancy which they had then, which was not terribly extensive. But in terms of, our UW system getting its funds back, not necessarily, not in our lifetimes, I would count on it.
Yeah.
That's the other advantage of it, that the pushing against teachers and public sphere and organized labor for teachers, that becomes a powerful way of pushing away visibility. Because ultimately, a strong public education system does, however partially and compromised by its own kind of liberal, overly reformist baggage, does provide a way to access alternative views and politics and visions of a different world, of visions of alternatives.
Yeah.
All right. And I think something that you touched on, Joe, that I was going to comment on was the usage of the media, right? Because for instance, us as historians, right, the one thing that we're going to look at is who's the person that's conducting the narrative, who's in control of the narrative, what's their potential biases or whatever that they have, etc. So if we pay attention to how, let's say, the Occupy movement or labor rallies or strikes and all that stuff is portrayed in the media, a lot of the time it's not exactly some glowing report on all these people want is a little bit better healthcare, or all they want is 25 cents extra an hour or whatever. Instead it shows them all standing around on the street holding signs, and it kind of tries to make them look lazy for the most part. And I think the unfortunate part about that is that there's so much this push for the free market system. The free market system is supposed to be this great and amazing thing, and I think what people don't realize is that in the free market system, the one power that you have to let's say keep the system from stomping down on you is to not go to work.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you're not doing work, then they can't be making money off of you. It's true, you're not getting paid for it, but at the same time, they're not making money off of your labor either. And on top of it, you can also not buy their product.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, there's all sorts of restrictions on those types of things and those types of behaviors and everything, which is really unfair, because then that's really not a free market then, is it? It's supposed to be a free market for the people that have the money and control the means of production and all that.
And I think certainly, look, even now, more in retrospect, that spring of 2011 is missed strike opportunity, or an opportunity where, and of course it's illegal and fenced in and scary and dangerous in a large number of ways, but it's so fenced off because it is the thing that is actively effective. That group of workers, by virtue of not simply being, in terms of the worthless parasites that the Journal Sentinel has graciously described us as, but instead,
we have only one newspaper in the city too.
But instead being the sort of the foundation of which all the other things happen, so that with taking workings to remove ourselves from the work of production and shutting down means of production is an argument that can't be blocked ultimately. That if done, that is where power and the basis of power lies. I mean, not to overly utilize these sort of like missed opportunities. I mean, I think given how disorganized and sort of chaotic and how little experience most people have had with any kind of confrontation with authority, within Wisconsin, it's surprising that it went as far as it did. But I mean, a general strike would have been, I think, unlikely. But what might have been possible was a one-day strike. I mean, you shut down Madison schools with only 40% of people calling in sick. You don't need every person, but you need enough people and enough energy and push and grassroots energy and leadership, ultimately, getting out of the way and letting that happen. And I think that wouldn't necessarily mean that we'd be sitting in terms of Wisconsin without Walker at this point of it, but it would have, I think, shown that there were other tools available, and would have given a lot of people the experience of going against the employers, going against the capitalist class, and holding the ground, at least for a moment. And then perhaps that's all that we can hope for in the near future, that that is different than the kind of continual retreat, compromise, hope and change, expectation, defeat, compromise that we've otherwise experienced.
Which is incredible. I mean, I think that Rich, you were talking about how there are active limitations and kind of fences that kind of prevent that kind of action from happening. And I think that one of them is the contract, right? Like that so much of energy has gone into collective bargaining and the contract as kind of this compromise. And I think that what's so remarkable about this move is that it completely disregards that as a compromise, right? That it's being treated as an extreme on the left, right? That they're a collectively bargained contract is entirely benefiting workers, right, and not employers, right? It's not helping the bosses at all. That needs to go away, which is remarkable because I mean that's the contract that's keeping, with the contract with no strike clauses, particularly for public workers, that it's really keeping, everything in check, right? And so to disregard that, is just a phenomenal shift that it could open up some doors for work stoppages, but like you had indicated, I mean it's not likely because it's so we've become so like a lot of activist work, a lot of labor's energy has been built around getting a contract and collectively bargaining it, right? For generations and generations and generations, this is what's been worked out, and this is the kind of the bureaucratization of this activism, and to the point where they're in imagining what activism outside of it, labor activism outside of that, what direct action might look like. It's very difficult to imagine.
Yeah, but
well, I just want to make a comment quick. So one thing that always fascinates me about the contract thing, right, is that it seems like people always want to try and make it seem like the contract limits business leaders from what it is that they can and cannot do. And really the contract works both ways. All right. For those of us who have worked in a union, I've been in the Steelworkers Union and now I'm currently in the Teachers Union, right? MGA is part of the Teachers Union. And, there's disciplinary outlines for what the expectations are for you as an employee and things that you can and cannot do. So it's not like it's something that gives us all sorts of amazing, wonderful, super duper rights or whatever. A lot of the time it actually gives the employer sort of it's just an agreement, and I don't see why it's such a big problem. It's like the business owner's like some big tyrannical autocrat that wants to be able to just fire you arbitrarily if they feel like it, and when they have that power taken away from them, they hate oh my god, I can't live with going through any type of bureaucratic channels or whatever to get rid of somebody who I think is not a good worker or don't like their face or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that the development of contract is the basis for union organizing and activism. Of it had a number of consequences, among other things, encouraging the development of more professional, bureaucratic corporate unions that would have enormous distance between higher ups and rank and file. That would be extremely undemocratic. And that would also, so then in that sense, when you create that sort of internal hierarchy by which in terms of official leaders are going to have more in common with in terms of employers that they're negotiating with, why would it be surprising that they would, in terms of, not represent their members' interests effectively? That they would
because unions have to have their own management too.
They would balance. They would in terms of endorse stability and sort of status quo and kind of stable political allies.
Yeah.
And the preservation of exploitative working conditions, which means then that all you need to do to undercut unions even further is make sort of the change happen sort of slowly, happen gradually in a way that doesn't stir up too many people and they keep their own members down. So I mean that's the model that seems, again, sort of capitalist power of it is extremely effective. But so in that sense, it's an additional sign of worrying that in terms of Walkers and the Alex of the world are now going against that and deciding that even that provides too many guarantees, too much limitations. Just tear that up and go for all of it.
Because this is a collection that I'm working on for a museum right now, this corporate archives, and I found this thing about this union negotiation contract that they were going through in 1987, and they're calling what we now call neoliberalism rationalizing, the workplace, right? So they're getting people to agree to a certain number of weeks off a year or whatever to try and mitigate plant closings and save jobs and stuff, and that's what they tell them, so that way they sign up for these things, But wouldn't it be amazing if just for one single day, it has to be the same day, right, that everybody that makes minimum wage didn't go to work? Do you imagine what would happen? Seriously, and I'm just in this state, the whole state would probably grind to a halt, because that's all you people that work at your gas stations, people that work at McDonald's, everything else like that. You're not going to be able to get your fancy coffee and put gas in your car. I mean, it'd be mass hysteria. It'd be beautiful. Oh my God, I can't buy things for a day. From some disgruntled minimum wage worker that probably can't afford their rent because of it.
Yeah, and that brings the question, I mean, within Milwaukee, and even more for historians living in Milwaukee. I certainly feel that in terms of these past 3 years in the city have opened my eyes to a number of things, and been a sort of exciting time, even if sort of exciting as we sort of get further undermined and have rights butchered and eroded, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess beyond that, and as historians of it, I mean, what can we do anything effective in alternative? Are there uses of our time that might sort of matter? I mean, is there anything that the legacy of the city and labor as a whole that would teach us about correcting this? I mean,
well, my personal belief on it is knowledge is power all the time. And it's a tool at the same time. So you should try and give people as much of it as you possibly can, and then let them, decide for themselves if they want to accept it or reject it. I mean, because you can't force people to believe what you want them to believe or to think what you want them to think. And you shouldn't be able to, because people have a right to think for themselves. If they choose to be ignorant, they can go and choose to be ignorant. They can choose to be smart, whatever they want to do. But you have to give them something to work with, and let them make those decisions by themselves. That's what I would say. And I mean, I think our task as historians is to, or at least something that I try to do when I act as a TA, is to, draw these connections across history from things that are happening then and things that are happening now, so that way people can kind of appreciate there's a sort of pattern to human behavior, and if you can kind of see the pattern, right, you can avoid it. It's sort of that whole, if we don't study history, then we're doomed to repeat it, that famous saying.
Well, maybe if I could expand on that a little bit, I think that that what you're describing is what I completely agree with too. That part of our role here in Milwaukee, and I think that this could be said of historians everywhere, that part of our role is to aid in the praxis, right? To aid in the actual discussion and review of things that have worked and things that haven't, and do so in such a way that we understand that we are also historical actors, right? In doing so, right? That by creating a narrative, we are, creating a narrative or constructing a narrative or whatever you want to call it, in a particular historical moment is an act of engaging in that historical moment, right? And I think that is it on one hand, and I think the other hand is, you have to balance that with, the von Rankian notion of, telling history as it actually existed, right? The only way that can actually have any credibility or truth behind it, or to actually make these kinds of decisions, is to have an adequate understanding of what it is that actually happened, right? Including all the alternatives, right? And maybe even highlighting alternatives more so. And I think that part one of this is actively engaging the community, and I think that the three of us have no problem with that. I mean, we're already living here. We're already going to school here. We've got students. We shop. We
Drink.
We drink. We walk around on the streets, and we are active participants in that. And I think that kind of gives us a certain amount of understanding then of what is needed, and then we can go from there. And I think that Milwaukee's a very unique case. I think that it doesn't fit, to kind of maybe refer back to our previous conversations. I think that it's unique, like to rely on histories of, say, Cleveland or Detroit or Chicago or whatever to adequately inform what's going on here. While it does, I mean, it helps. It doesn't give us all the tools. So, part of it is going in and figuring out exactly what it is that we need from these narratives, and then doing the research that's required to figure it out. I don't know if that's that might be a bit of a general
I think
generalized.
I think it's a useful generalization of it. Yeah, and I think in some ways, I mean, as little as we make and as precarious as position is, and we do have the advantage of being in a profession and being near the front lines of cuts and aggressive right-wing assaults, but at the same time, the nature of our work that we're doing of it positions us to comment on that and to bring a broader perspective and assessment than would otherwise be the case. But at the same time, there's just some limitations in our profession that within academia generally, but also within historians that I think need to, be alert from and partly struggle against. I mean, not in the sense of punching out, in terms of other, sort of more, functionally apolitical colleagues or the like of it, but just finding our own, pathways of it that don't, I think, lend itself as much like academic obsolescence or what the context of the OAH this year that was in Milwaukee, but
right.
Among other things had the conference that talked about neoliberalism and discontents and focused a lot on neoliberalism and analysis of game theory and sort of the intellectual development of the Austrian School of Economics, but gave very little attention to the much more overt, obvious ways that neoliberalism has been unfolding across the past 30 decades. It was, because being concerned with the specific theory and the intellectual legacy is something that you can comment on and write articles that will be read by other historians, and that hopefully for at least a few people get tenure or get in terms of more advantageous tenure. Whereas if you take the opposite approach, which Rich have commented on and certainly endorse of. You see neoliberalism, you see unregulated capitalism by seeing how it's literally changing the city around you and the people around it. And at that point, you're not just there to write your thesis or dissertation or article or new book on the ways the impacting city should be. There in the front line trying to make for once, the story have a different ending.
Well, and to make that kind of an analysis too, to focus on perhaps the intellectual origins of these things, lends an incredible amount of power to the ideas themselves, right? As opposed to the people who, the actual actors, the actual historical actors who made the decisions that said, hey, that sounds like a great idea, that helps describe exactly what I want to do,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that provides hopefully, at least maybe, the usual way of, sort of historians on the left, in terms of about 45 minutes of complete gloom, despair, and the immense odds, futility of other options, and then maybe, 5 minutes at the end of at least, possible hope or some way it might be, able to work and learn something at least from.
Oh, you mean end on
dystopian.
a happy note? Is that what you're saying?
As happy as we get, perhaps.
Oh, okay.
Well, perhaps
it might be what historians drink.
Well,
and the fact that we are in Milwaukee, which is the other.
Well, yeah, and it's just so convenient. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially
and
in this neighborhood. This neighborhood's great. Love it.
Polls are going to be closing in about 5 minutes, right? So I don't know how many people we've got listening, but if you haven't voted yet, I guess at least get in line, right? So
yeah. We'll,
or if you can teleport. Probably.
This is a super historical moment, whether you agree with the electoral.
Doesn't matter who you're going to vote for.
tactics,
Just go and do it. It's your civic duty.
Yeah.
And then you're entitled to complain about the outcome.
Right.
Exactly. And then either way, it'll be very interesting after 5 minutes over once polls close and we know whether or not there's a recount. Because either way, what we figure out is a community of it as a state to do next. Right. Since the recall is not going to be the answer either way. You're going to have to either face the reality that corporate money outbuys democracy, and we cannot run it, or that if it's Tom Barrett of it, then it's not just the Walker problem. We have to struggle as well. So either way.
So much for ending on a happy note here.
Yeah. Thanks,
well, but
man.
I guess maybe hit the polls and then hit the streets, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's also rally tomorrow, June 6th, 5 p.m. actually in I think Zeidler Square again.
Is there?
Keep it alive.
All right. Thanks, Jacob.
Yep. Thanks.